Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the POK Podcast. Before we get started today, I just want to give you guys kind of an update on where we're trying to take this podcast, what sort of feedback we've gotten, what we want to do with it. And what's come to our attention is that with all the heady topics and often political topics that we talk about, it can be very hard to consume that on a regular basis unless you have something sort of to escape to and get away from for a while. And so, on that note, what we're thinking about doing is incorporating some information about popular TV shows, which is how we get away from all this stuff. It can get overwhelming after a certain point.
Most
And
definitely.
so what we want to do is try and balance that out with some content that's a little bit more fun, a little bit less heady, a little bit less effortful as far as having to contribute to the conversation, and really just something you can have fun with. And so
Mhm.
to kind of segue from that, we have some new Game of Thrones news that I think is worth mentioning.
Oh, absolutely.
This is actually sort of where we got this idea is I posted something on our Facebook page about Game of Thrones coming out with a prequel to the series, and it blew up, which is really nice. But that's sort of what led us to believe that we should probably balance out our content a little bit.
Right.
And so, what do we know about this prequel? So, it will be coming out after 2019 when Game of Thrones finishes up. And what we do know is that it will take place thousands of years before the events of Game of Thrones. So we'll be seeing characters like Brandon the Builder, the dude who I can't remember who started the Lannister house,
That guy.
and it will talk about the origins of the White Walkers, etc. And the extra good news is that HBO is willing to dump some big bucks into it. I think they said they were looking at $50 million a season, which is a decent amount.
For a
So
TV show.
we are
that's
super
insane.
excited for that. We are Game of Thrones junkies. Our watch hasn't ended yet, and it shouldn't watch for you guys, and for you guys as well. So, on that note, since we're talking about Game of Thrones, let's segue into our president. So, so on today's
I'll buy it.
episode,
Yeah.
on today's episode of the POK podcast, we're going to be talking about presidential powers, and should be prefaced that our founding fathers supported a rather weak executive branch of government, mostly because they didn't want someone like Joffrey taking over. So, whenever a president makes a campaign speech, when they're on the candidate trail, they typically make a lot of promises. They tell you they're going to fix the economy. They tell you they're going to add more jobs. They tell you they're going to fix the healthcare system. They're going to address the immigration issue. That they're going to do all these things. So it should be rather, I would say, important to address: can a president actually do those things, and is it
Right.
realistic for them to, for one, make those promises, and do they actually have any capacity to uphold them? And if they don't, do they deserve the blame, or does someone else? Or does anyone deserve the blame? Is it more of a structural issue? We're going to find out today. So let's start by talking about the formal powers of the presidency. So these are the powers that are explicitly written in the Constitution. And as you'll find out, there's not a whole lot of them. And this is sort of what I was taught in AP government, that the executive branch really doesn't have that much power. They're more of a symbolic position. But we digress. So we'll look more into this. So the first form of power, and the one that everyone's probably most familiar with, is the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So originally this only included the Navy and the Army, but since we have an Air Force now, it also includes that. The president also has the power to veto laws passed by Congress. So the caveat to that is that Congress can just say, well, we don't accept your veto as long as they have a 2/3 majority vote. Next, the president also has the power to negotiate treaties with foreign nations in addition to receiving ambassadors. So what's important to note about the treaties bit is that presidents typically don't write those. That's mostly taken care of by the Senate. However, they do take most of the credit for it, which should come as no surprise since the president is more of the symbolic face of the nation. So it makes sense that they would take the credit for it. But
Right.
yeah, it's a little bit annoying when they go out of their way to take all the credit for it.
Right.
And the receiving ambassadors bit is actually really important because receiving an ambassador can legitimize a country as a foreign power. So, for example, if North Korea sent an ambassador over to the United States and President Trump had received that ambassador, that would be sending a message to North Korea that we acknowledge you as a legitimate force and power. Just an example. So, let's go on to, I'm sorry, I swiped on my computer
There's
and
so
went
much
all the way
research
down.
on this topic.
So Here's the one that I actually want to spend a little bit more time talking about because it is one of the more controversial, if not the most controversial, formal powers. So this is just a power that's written directly in the Constitution. The president also has the power to grant pardons.
Mm-hmm.
So this can only apply to federal crimes, not state crimes. And so this has been a highly debated power of the president for a long time now, ever since the Constitution was written. So there's two main restrictions. The first one we just mentioned, right, it has to be a federal crime. It can't be a state crime, and it can't be implemented in a case of impeachment.
Right. It's
So,
mostly like crimes against the U.S., right, that
yeah.
are forgiven.
The other thing that's worth mentioning about a pardon is that it comes with an admission of guilt.
Right.
So
Okay.
if a pardon is granted to someone, they are more or less confessing to the fact that they've committed a federal crime.
Right. They're not like, oh, it wasn't me. I didn't do it.
No. So the reason why I want to talk about this a little bit further is because Trump recently in the news had talked about that he had the absolute power to pardon himself. Now, for whatever you may think of Trump, in principle, let's just look to see if this is actually a possibility, because common sense logic would say, well, that's probably not a good idea if a president pardons himself.
Right.
Well, the first main defense that Trump has in his argument that he does have the absolute power to pardon himself is that it's not actually written in the Constitution that he can't. But here's the thing. The Supreme Court could just rule it unconstitutional.
Right.
But the critics of this idea that a president can pardon himself will say that it's more of a language thing than anything else. So they look at the actual language of the Constitution and say, okay, well, the president has the power to grant constitutions. The word grant implies that you have to give it to someone else, not yourself.
You can't grant it to yourself.
Now, in my opinion, that's a rather weak argument trying to say
Right.
that the president can't pardon himself. That's more of just a matter of interpretation of language, which you can pick any word in the English lexicon and you can have a debate about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I necessarily buy that.
Fair enough.
But if you do buy it, so if you're a constitutional fundamentalist and you say, well, grant implies that you have to give it to someone else, not yourself, there's still a loophole around that logic. So the president could invoke what the 25th Amendment, temporarily relieving himself of any duties as the president of the United States. He would then give that power to the vice president, of which could grant the former president or the president who just invoked the 25th Amendment a full pardon.
So, but the 25th Amendment is, it basically says that you are no longer capable of serving as president, right?
Yes.
That's the point of the 25th Amendment. So
it can be temporary, though.
Sure, but like it's not something that people use lightly. They're not just like, oh, I'm not feeling good today. 25th Amendment time. Like,
yeah, so
it's tragic.
It's a little bit, that loophole would probably never, ever take place.
Right.
Again, because the Supreme Court would probably shut it down.
Right.
But there's been a few debates as to just the nature of what a pardon is.
Right.
And so there are a lot of people that say, well, okay, so if the president has the sole and absolute power to determine who is worthy of the president's mercy, if you will.
Okay.
Wouldn't that give him incentive to take bribes? Again, unlikely and would be deemed unconstitutional, most likely.
Right.
But on paper, you could do that, right? Because you could take any sort of bribe you want, just not call it a bribe, and give someone a pardon. Right. And you alone are the only determining
factor of who gets
pardon
and who doesn't. Yeah. As far as Trump pardoning himself, there is no scenario that I can think of where that would not be an obstruction of justice. Like if he is being pursued for a certain crime or charged for a certain crime and he pardons himself, I mean, that's the textbook definition of obstruction of justice.
Yeah, and while Trump is the only reason we're really including Trump in this whole bit is because he made a statement.
He said that he could pardon himself,
which we can debate on being a rather not so intelligent thing to do. But as far as being an obstruction of justice, so there's a kind of common sense rule of thumb in law that basically says you can't be your own judge.
Okay, yeah.
So if a pardon is a judgment of who deserves mercy, it would not logically flow then that the president should have the capacity to be his own judge.
Right. It's kind of one of those things that you hear and you're just like, no, that's not right.
Yeah, and the other thing with pardons is it very much steps into the judicial branch of government,
Right.
principally. So the idea of letting someone off the hook for a crime committed, so granted the executive branch is responsible for enforcing laws, and
Mm-hmm.
then the judicial branch is responsible for interpreting them, correct?
Right.
So this would be an interpretation of whether or not a crime uh, is worthy of mercy, in my opinion. So I feel like this is a particular power that seems more fitted for the Supreme Court than it does for the executive branch.
Agreed. I agree. I think that this is more of a power that belongs to the judicial branch than maybe the presidential executive
Yeah.
branch.
So, lastly, on the formal powers, we're already at the end of that list. The president has the power and responsibility to appoint federal officials. So there's like 6,000 of these positions. So it's very unlikely that a president actually does fill all these
I don't think
positions.
anyone ever fills all of them.
Yeah, I don't
Not
think,
himself.
at least not in our lifetime. And
Well, I'm assuming they were significantly less at one point than they are now.
yeah, and this is, we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about the informal powers, but this is also a way that the president can implement his legislative agenda by appointing officials that he really likes.
That
That are
jive
going
with
to,
his worldview.
yeah, that are going to jive with his worldview.
Yeah.
Now, the thing with the appointees that the president can hire, they all have to go through the Senate. The Senate is the judge as to whether the gatekeeper as to whether or not any of these appointees can actually be hired.
Well, yeah, sure, but as we've seen, candidates that perform poorly don't necessarily get the boot.
That's true.
So,
And also, and we'll talk about this even more in depth because it's even more applicable to some of the other concerns that we might have,
mm-hmm.
is what happens when you are appointing someone, if you say, hypothetically, you're a Republican president, you hire someone that is uh, consistent with a hardcore Republican ideology,
Mm-hmm.
the Senate is controlled by Republicans,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to get the vote they need to pass this appointee through.
For sure. For sure.
So it's not really a whole lot of a check if your party's ideology is the one in control when it comes to the Congress and the executive branch.
Right.
So let's move on to the implied powers because this is where the meat is. This is where a lot of the controversy is. And a lot of the maybe things that you guys might not have been aware of at first. So I certainly wasn't. So the informal powers are the powers that are not explicitly granted to the president in the Constitution, but are logically implied by what's written in the Constitution.
Okay.
Which that there alone has some controversy written into it because the Constitution was written a long time ago, and if we're still interpreting it either literally or if we're trying to put our own spin off on it for today, it's
this ain't tarot cards, all right? We're not interpreting.
It's kind of complex and difficult to do. And if one president does something and another, in the future decides that, oh, well, I want to expand this power and the Supreme Court doesn't put a check on it, now a precedent has been set, which basically means that any president afterwards can do the same thing. And we'll see how that turns out when we look at executive powers. So first of the informal powers comes with the title of being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Mm-hmm. So normally, the president is not supposed to be able to deploy troops without the approval of Congress. So Congress has to declare war before you can go send troops somewhere.
Right.
However, in recent decades, this has not been the case whatsoever. Presidents have sent troops well ahead of Congress's approval. And some examples of those, there was Korea, there was Iraq, there was Vietnam.
So when did it stop? When did it go from being like you really need congressional approval to meh?
So it has to do with this idea of what poses an immediate risk to national security.
Okay.
So, like we said, normally you need that approval from Congress. However, there's this implication as being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces that you had the responsibility to protect the nation.
Okay.
Especially in the case of an immediate national security threat, which gives you the inherent power to send troops if you deem it necessary.
So what does that mean, immediate national security threat?
That is a fantastic question. It's a very vague term and intentionally so. So the American people don't get a whole lot
It doesn't mean anything.
The American people don't get a whole lot of information on what necessarily constitutes a national security risk. We hear what is told to us, but because of executive privilege and the threat to national security and keeping some information on lockdown, there's very little transparency about what actually constitutes a national emergency. And this is actually where a lot of conspiracy theories are born, because there is this theory or this idea that if all a president needs is a national security threat to send troops somewhere, it would give them the incentive they want to send troops to make their own threat. And so there's quite a few conspiracy theories around this. A lot of the 9/11 conspiracies are around this very theory that all a president needs to do is create a conflict and then send troops somewhere.
To achieve whatever goal they're trying to achieve.
Exactly.
Huh, okay.
So there's a loophole for you.
All right.
So we just talked about what actually constitutes an immediate risk. Don't really know. So Congress decided that they want, after Vietnam, that they need to put a little bit more of a check on presidents' ability to do this.
All right.
But as you see, that's not necessarily something that ended up turning out. So they passed the War Powers Resolution, I believe it was what it's called.
Okay.
Yeah, War Powers Resolution. So what the War Powers Resolution did is that it said, okay, President, if there's an immediate risk, you can send troops somewhere. However, you need to get congressional approval in 60 days. Otherwise, you have to bring them back. Turns out Congress has never actually required a president to bring troops back.
Sure, but if you straight up send troops into an area and then Congress says, all right, no, we don't agree with this, you got to pull them back. I mean, you've kind of already knocked over the milk jug, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of being like, oh, JK, come on back, everybody, it's totally fine. Like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
And like in 60 days, you could do a whole lot of damage. And if you find out you're there for the wrong reasons, Iraq, then you're basically screwed, because now you have almost locked your troops into a location. And what about also the political fallout of Congress saying, okay, you have to send the troops back? How does that look on a president if they made a grave error?
Oh, it's completely undermining their power and their presidency, right? If Congress
and their legitimacy. And so it would make sense that Congress would probably never, or at the very least, be very hesitant to put this check on a president, as they often defer to the president when it comes to matters of national security. They just kind of let the president do his thing.
Okay.
But yeah, it's very unlikely that Congress would ever put this kind of check on a president, just because of the political fallout. And with where we're at with partisan politics, if something looks bad for the president, it looks bad for the president's party.
Right.
So take that as you will.
Okay.
So moving on to the implied diplomatic powers of the presidency. So we talked before in the formal powers that the president has the power to pass treaties.
Okay.
So treaties are a little bit harder to get through Congress. They require 2/3 of a vote. Executive agreements, however, which are basically treaties with a different name, only need a simple majority to pass. So they're a lot easier to get through, but they're a little bit less durable, if you will, on paper.
Than the treaties?
Yeah, they're a little bit easier to overturn.
Okay.
But they rarely get overturned. However, executive agreements are, one could argue, a little bit more potent in the sense that they just need a party that has control of the Congress to really get through really easily. So presidents in the past have really preferred this method because it's more efficient, it gets the job done quicker without a whole lot of this legislative nonsense in Congress of getting something passed.
There's less hoops to jump through, right?
So there's been some arguments, though, that the ability to pass executive agreements is very much a power grab for the presidency because they can just go out on their own and strike a deal. However, it really comes down to the controlling party. And this is something that I really want to punch through because so many of these powers and the checks on these powers are kind of on this balance between, okay, how does this look on the party versus how does this look on the president? And just about in every single case, Congress will put the blame on the president way before they take the blame for any of their own problems.
Okay.
And so with executive agreements, it gives the president more power if their party is in control, again, because it's super easy to pass. Now, this is problematic, especially if an executive agreement has huge implications, and if only 51 out of 100 people say, yeah, I'm okay with it, I'd probably want a little bit more information.
51 is a failing grade.
Yeah, it's not a very good score. And so I would like to think there would be a better way to go about some of these bigger stakes agreements and pass just a simple majority vote, because what you get with the simple majority vote is that just about half of the people in that vote don't think it's a good idea. I would like to see more 60-40 votes, but here's the problem with that is that Congress is already stagnant enough as it is. And so if you had to make everything a 60-40 vote,
nothing would get done.
It wouldn't be much of a stretch to say that Congress wouldn't do anything. So that's executive agreements. The next implied power comes with the president's, the idea that the president is regarded as the CEO of the United States. This mostly extends from his power to elect federal officials, as that's very CEO-like.
Okay.
So, and also because he can appoint officials that agree with what he wants to do on a legislative point of view, he can very much influence the way the government acts, and this is why he gets the title, or the implicit title, of being the CEO of the United States. And on that note, the president also has the power to set a legislative agenda.
Okay, what does that mean?
So by making president in and of himself can't just pass a law to Congress. He can't go to Congress, hand him a law he wants passed, and say, pass it. Okay. So it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Okay.
So normally the lawmaking is supposed to be the job of Congress.
Right.
And you can work with the president on that, but generally it's supposed to be the job of Congress. So what the president can do is he can do what's called a legislative initiative.
Okay.
So this means he takes a law or a bill that he has his cabinet or officials write up.
Right.
And then he goes, sends that to a congressional member that he likes, and then that congressional member can look it over and say, I like this bill. I'm going to put this on the House floor, in which case then it can get sent to Congress. A Congress member, however, has to be the one to introduce this bill. Okay. It can't be the president himself.
Okay.
So that's the important caveat to that. Again, when it comes down to who's the controlling party, this kind of agenda making is a hell of a lot easier when you are the controlling party.
Right.
It's a lot harder if you don't have any friends in Congress.
Right. Okay.
So my concern with the legislative initiative is that this is very much the executive branch seeping into the legislative process.
Okay.
And while I don't necessarily have a problem with a president giving their input on laws, as I think that's perfectly fine, especially if you're the symbol of our country, I would like to see more of the responsibility and the initiative portion of that, so actually coming forth with better ideas to be taken by Congress versus the president. Because what you end up getting here is this incentive for the president to kind of take this preemptive action to fix things when he comes into office.
Right. It just makes me, it kind of makes me question what the point of Congress is. If one of their main concerns is, being able to push the blame off on the president. So it just makes me wonder what kind of problems can be incited, or does this incite from kind of, I guess, this avoidance of blame or responsibility?
So it comes down, it's politics, right? So it's just, I want either my candidate or my party to look good. And as long as big money is in politics, I want my constituents to look good as well. And so I don't want to do anything that would compromise the maybe positive outlook on my party. And so any kind of responsibility that they can pass off to being the presidents, why not for them, right? In many ways, some would argue that could be a good thing. It makes Congress a hell of a lot more efficient if the president's the one making all the choices and the one passing all these legislative initiatives.
I would say it makes Congress more efficient. It makes Congress pointless.
It makes it less effective. Efficient, less effective.
That's right. Okay.
So, and generally in the American public, we like efficiency. So we might be okay with a trade-off like that, depending on where you're at. Especially if you don't like Congress, you're probably okay with a president making more decisions for you. So,
Just a waste of taxpayer dollars.
yeah, we could do a whole episode talking about the problems of Congress. So, now to the part that I've been looking forward to.
Oh.
I'm not really a conspiracy person, but I do like trying to figure out how do we get to some ass backwards ways of thinking about our government, and this one's the start of it. So
this is the juicy bit.
This is the juicy bit.
Okay.
Executive orders.
Okay.
So for the longest time, I just kind of thought these things were just like the president can go God mode and just say, yeah, I want this to be a law.
Mm-hmm.
So an executive order is a rule or a directive that the president can pass that has the same power as a law. Maybe I'm dumb, but this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me as to why a president would have this power. Now, I understand why it's a more popular power among presidents, especially over the last two presidencies, and we'll talk about that. But the fact that the president even have this capacity to pass an executive order is a little bit iffy.
Right, but there's going to be a check on it, right?
Well, yeah, so it can be overturned by the normal legislative process,
Okay.
but that could take a while.
Okay.
And if you have the, again, controlling party, you're never going to have to worry about one of your executive orders being overturned, as long as they're constitutional executive orders, and we can talk about that.
Okay.
But yeah, I think what the founding fathers kind of had in mind here, and I give us your opinions on this one, because this one just seems crazy to me, is executive orders were with the expectation that a president would work with Congress.
Okay.
And that say something needed to be done really quickly in order to fix a certain policy or a way that we were doing things, or a way that we were enforcing certain laws.
There's some kind of immediate problem happening.
Yeah, there's some sort of immediate problem-solving initiative that we could take.
Okay.
Well, that's not really how President Obama or Donald Trump have used the executive power.
Okay.
We'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing, I don't know if I remember mentioning this, but the Supreme Court can deem it unconstitutional, and that would null and void an executive order.
Right.
So it should be noted, executive orders are not the same as laws passed by Congress. They're not as durable. They can just as easily be overturned by the next president that comes into office. Prime example, Trump overturning DACA shortly after he came into office. So
Right.
DACA was an executive order. Trump can overturn that order the second he comes into office.
Right.
So that's why he was able to get away with that. Now, there's still some disputes as to whether or not the Supreme Court is deeming it constitutional. I didn't do a whole lot of reading into that bit, but let us know what you think. Should presidents have the ability to just overturn executive orders, or should their capacity to even pass executive orders be limited? But
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah, it's a little. I understand the need for it to some extent, because when you have Congress, when the public perception of Congress is pretty obvious, right? Most people think Congress is slow, stagnant, doesn't get a whole lot done. After the whole Facebook incident, they're oblivious about how the internet works, one could argue. Like, there's not a lot of faith in Congress. I think their approval rating is like 18% or something like that.
Here's the reality. If an executive order is doing something that I agree with, I'm far more inclined to say that it's fine versus something that I don't agree with. I'm far more inclined to...
So good point. So with DACA,
Mm-hmm.
the majority of Americans don't mind it.
Mm-hmm.
However, what caused all the outrage was the way President Obama went about passing DACA. He did through an executive order.
Instead of Congress.
Exactly. And presidents do not have the power to determine immigration policy. However, as we'll talk with Donald Trump, if you deem it a national security risk, there's some loopholes around that. But with DACA, and Obama pretty much put it to Congress. He said, well, if you don't like my executive order, pass a bill.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A lot of people, especially conservatives, were not very happy about that, because
Did Congress pass a bill?
No. That's why we have DACA and not an immigration bill. And Trump is...
Oh, we don't just give that much to do our job.
Well, they can't agree on it. And
right.
When the House is split, even though Republicans have a slight majority...
You can't pass anything if they're split.
Exactly.
Okay.
So one critique of this particular implementation of the executive order with DACA was that it very much, again, dipped into the legislative process, and it was something that should have been left to Congress. So,
Right.
my 2 cents on this: I don't mind DACA. I do actually mind the way that President Obama went about it. I also understand to some extent why he passed it the way he did. He felt
Right.
that Congress wouldn't be able to get it done, and so he felt there was an immediate need to protect uh, uh, DACA recipients, and so he passed it. On the other hand, right, it sets a precedent of what's called executive unilateralism.
Okay.
So what this basically means is that what we're seeing now is an expansion of the executive branch, such that they can dip their toes in all the other and both of the other branches, and have power in those particular roles.
Right. So their power is slowly growing without any real repercussions.
Yes, and there's very few checks that are actually implemented to stop presidents from doing this.
Or happening.
But presidents, this is becoming more popular executive orders because it's easier than getting a law passed through the normal legislative process,
Right.
which is absolutely true. But I think that's more.
But also frustrating because
Yeah.
it's Congress's fault for not being willing to work on these things.
Yeah, and we can talk more about just the butting heads of these ideologies and why they just can't ever agree on anything because they fundamentally disagree on everything.
Right.
But we'll get to that. So once again, if the party heads or the president is the leader of your party, executive orders carry a little bit more weight during the term of your presidency.
Right. Okay.
So I think it's worth talking about the travel ban as well if we're going to critique Obama for the DACA decision.
Right.
So the travel ban, still in legal disputes in the courts. So the Supreme Court basically said, after Trump made some amendments to it, or his administration made some amendments to the travel ban to make it a case-by-case basis, the Supreme Court said that we can't really deem it unconstitutional as long as it's a case-by-case basis. So that's where it's at right now. But this kind of comes back to what is considered a national security risk, what is considered an immediate risk. It's kind of hard to tell. And especially when there's very little transparent information around what this risk is, right? So we saw this with Iraq and President Bush, where we didn't exactly have all the information. The public didn't. And one could argue not President Bush either, but mostly there wasn't a whole lot of transparency about why we were going there. We were looking for an enemy, and turns out there's no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So there's some misleading information there. So national security risk, who's to blame? We like pointing fingers. And that's sort of the same reaction that we saw with the travel ban. However, it was a little bit less clear as to why it was perceived as an immediate risk.
Okay.
As I forget the department name, but one of the agencies came out and said, okay, well, there is no evidence to suggest that people from any of these countries, which were predominantly Muslim countries, were any more terrorist
any more of a predominant risk
than any other country. That was their findings. I'll try and find it and post a link for it. But yeah, the point being is that it was a little bit more obscure. It's kind of hard to tell what counts as a national security risk. And for those reasons, I think it's worth debating at least.
So, I mean, but it comes back to this idea of rules that are poorly defined and easily abused, right?
Yeah. This is just one of those cases where I think it needs to be less about the individual cases of when presidents make executive orders.
Right.
I think the habit that has become a trend by presidents to pass a bunch of executive orders is problematic. So the way I would pursue this is I would say, okay, whether I agree or disagree with the idea behind the executive order, I generally want Congress to be the ones that pass it. It's more durable, and a president just can't come in and say, I don't like it.
Well, and if Congress is passing it, then it has to go through this process of debate and deliberation and decision making versus just like, here's the executive order.
Yeah, but it should also be noted that the executive orders that Trump and Obama passed are hardly the most bold that any president has passed before.
Okay.
So the New Deal, the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln, the Manhattan Project,
Those are all executive orders?
those are all executive orders.
Hmm.
And one could argue they had far long-lasting and radical effects than a temporary travel ban or even DACA. So
Okay.
I think that's important to mention that as much as we don't like the
As much as there is debate about these are hardly the most
yeah, just
insane.
to give some context that they're not
Right.
insane or super radical
Right.
uh,
But
relative
there
to
has been radical ones so
yeah,
far.
and
Yeah.
so
Relative to their time, anyway.
some questions to consider. Are the checks and balances that are in place sufficient in regards to the president's ability to pass executive orders? Thoughts?
I mean, so here's the reality. Whoever takes office after Trump can very easily do what Trump did after Obama left office, which is, overturning a large portion of the executive orders that he put in place.
That wouldn't look very good, though.
Well, no, but it doesn't make Trump look good either that he did it.
Yeah, I just don't think that that's necessarily the best solution. We don't want to get into this habit,
Well, but,
right?
but my point being is that as far as executive orders go, like you said, there's not a whole lot of like strength to them in regards to how long they'll be around, right? Especially in some of these smaller things where it's just like, well, that doesn't make sense, but okay. Um, I do think though that there should be more gusto in um, challenging things that can be problematic instead of just being like, well, it's an executive order, it's fine, it'll go away with the next president. Like, I don't think that that should be an ideology that people have.
Oh no, I completely agree with that. I guess what I am most concerned about is that I feel like the Supreme Court needs a little bit more power in this case. So the reason I say the Supreme Court is because as far as the least biased and politically driven, they're a little bit closer to that than Congress is. Congress is the most divided body of people in our country.
Well,
So I think it's really hard for them to be able to put checks and balances on things when only half of them want to check.
aren't Supreme Court justices around for much longer than Congress members and that kind of thing?
I don't know that figure off the top of my head. I'll look into it.
I just like get the vibe that Supreme Court justices are not like being, and maybe I'm wrong, but like not near necessarily as corrupt or as like scratch my back as congressmen are. I feel like, and maybe they just have a good PR team, but that they're more about like justice and fairness and the Constitution and law than maybe Congress is.
Yeah, and even if they get things a little bit iffy from a humanitarian perspective because they are pretty much bound to the Constitution and their interpretation of it.
Right.
I think as far as interpreting the legality of some of these things,
Right.
they are the best suited for
They're
it.
doing their best, yeah.
And so I think the Supreme Court should have a little bit more power or at the very least, an executive order has to go through Supreme Court and go through some sort of check and balance before it is passed.
Okay.
So I think it's an order of operations thing for me.
Okay, so that it needs some kind of approval before it gets signed.
Yeah, because right now we have an executive branch that arguably has a little bit too much reach through executive orders. We have a Congress that's incredibly powerful on paper, but so dysfunctional that they can't exert that
Doesn't get
power.
anything done, yeah.
And then we kind of have the Supreme Courts, which are just there to say whether or not Congress or the executive branch fucked up. And so I think I think it will be maybe it's just, I don't know enough about congressional law and the way it works to really posit a good solution. But I'm wondering if a possible solution is to shift some of that power, some of those checks and balances to the Supreme Court and to do so before a law or a executive order is put into action. as opposed to after the fact.
Yeah, I can get on board with
Like,
that.
I want a president for an executive order to be required to work with Congress on it.
Right, or maybe he needs to have a certain number of Republicans and Democrats that support him or something like that.
Yeah, maybe that's another one, is that you have to get somebody from across party lines to say, yeah, I'm okay with this.
Right.
This is okay.
Yeah,
Maybe that's one way to go about it.
a little more balance.
So that covers about all the informal powers.
Okay.
You'll notice something in there. It didn't include anything about the economy or healthcare, which is two things that seem to get talked about a lot on campaign with campaign candidates and them giving promises to the people. So let's actually look at what powers do a president have over the economy.
Okay.
So this would probably fall more into the informal powers. But just about every presidential campaign that I've seen since I've been born has talked about jobs.
Gonna bring the jobs.
So here's the reality. The president doesn't actually have that much power over jobs.
Or the economy.
Or the economy. The main power that the president actually has is that he plays a role in fiscal policy.
Okay.
So taxes. So he gets to give his 2 cents on how taxes and government spending is implemented. But ultimately, it's Congress that passes those things. So once again, while he has a lot of the blame and responsibility attached to him, the president doesn't actually, in reality, have much power over those policies themselves. He can enforce them, because that's the executive branch's job, but he doesn't have the power to create them and then pass them into law.
Okay.
So, the big tax overhaul policy that was enacted under Trump's administration. So, it should be noted that they couldn't get a 2/3 vote for it. I think you need,
which is what most bills need.
You need 60 votes to pass a tax overhaul like this.
Okay.
Unless you go through what's called the reconciliation process, which basically means that as long as the budget committee says, yeah, this plan isn't going to add too much to the national debt, it's not going to cause too much harm in the short run, then you only need 51 votes. I don't really know a whole lot about the way that works. I'll be honest with you guys. If you guys can inform me a little bit more about that, that'd be awesome. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Okay.
Why require 60 votes and then say, well, I guess we really desperately need a tax overhaul, therefore, we'll just make it a majority vote. So as long as you're a Republican, you're good. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the same thing if it was vice versa. It's not. I don't see why that's the thing. Again, it seems like we have some of these policies just to kind of bypass the dysfunctionality that we already have.
Yeah. So I feel like there's a lot of loopholes to the system that we set up to create, balance and fairness and democracy. We have all these loopholes that can kind of like skirt tail democracy. So, how abundant are these loopholes and what kind of problems are they causing, or are they helpful? Maybe I can definitely see a situation where something good is trying to happen and maybe there is some disagreement and the loophole helps that good thing happen. But are they doing more harm than good? Should it be a strict government process or should we have these loopholes?
It's a hard question to answer. A slight tangent, but I think somewhat relevant to this. Maybe. Let me know what you think. There's only one nationally elected official in the United States, and that's the President of the United States.
Okay.
So think about that for a minute. Okay. Every other official in Congress
is either selected or state.
Well, they're elected in their states.
Well, like the vice president isn't elected; he's selected.
He's not nationally considered really. He's just kind of tagged along for the
right. So it's either a state election or they're selected.
Yeah. So if you think about that in and of itself as potentially problematic, I think, because you're getting a very narrow point of view. I feel like if you're being put into an office where you are now responsible for a nation, but your perspective is limited to what's going on in your state. Just some thoughts?
I mean, but I don't... I understand why we have it broken down by state, right? I mean...
Oh, it'd be too complicated. It would take forever.
It would be eons. And also, I think it's important. I mean, we are all states and we all have our different economies and our different, imports, or not imports, but goods that we create and different things that we value and give to the country. Um, and if we didn't have it broken up, then, I mean, obviously we're seeing this in California right now. It's too big of a state and it can't accommodate for the different varying socioeconomical climates that it has. So it's important that we have states. It's important that we have representatives from states. But I do think that it can create some maybe narrow-mindedness as far as what congressmen's goals are.
Yeah, just our 2 cents.
Food for thought.
But yeah, that was a tangent. So we're talking about
also, we should break up California. That would solve the problem.
That's for another podcast episode. But back to the economy for a second, and specifically this tax plan. So the tax plan, you could say, oh, well, that has immense effect on the economy, Dylan. That, it creates jobs because businesses have more money to throw around and they're not as restricted by taxes. Well, maybe. So I'm not going to sit here and claim to be an economic expert. However, here's what some other experts have to say.
However, I know how to read, and here's what the experts say.
So it's really hard to determine whether or not the tax plan or any tax plan works until many years after it's actually passed.
Until it's gone through the process of being a tax plan.
What is more impactful on the economy is just the business cycle. And so what that just means is that the economy naturally goes through some ups and downs. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. I am gross. So while, yes, you could argue that a tax cut could benefit growth, and that's perfectly possible. I will concede to that.
Right.
However, I just want to say that it's also a plausibility that the economy might have already been in somewhat of a healing period.
Right.
Unemployment wasn't exactly super high. It was fairly low.
It was high when Obama took office.
But to be fair, unemployment was super high. It was abysmal in 2010, and going into February. And so, that being said, I'm not going to give a bunch of credit to Trump for stimulating the economy. I'm also not going to give Obama a whole lot of credit for giving people jobs, in the sense that it was more of just the business cycle. Mm-hmm. If unemployment's super high, the only direction for any sort of stable economy to go is to bring employment back down.
Right.
So it seems equally as likely, just want to posit this, that it might just be the natural course of our economy as opposed to any direct interference by the government into the economy.
Okay.
So just some food for thought.
Right.
But that being said, as far as taxes go, the president does get to put his stamp on it. And so for whatever effects taxes do have, you could potentially give a credit at least a good deal of it to the president.
Okay.
But ultimately, what ends up happening with those tax policies is a congressional issue.
Right.
So some questions to consider here.
Okay.
If the president doesn't have as much control over the economy that we are sometimes led to believe by all campaign promises that are made by these candidates, who really deserves some of that responsibility when the economy tanks? Is it any one individual? Is it government? Is it just businesses?
Well, I mean, I think something that we've talked about before is the importance of, obviously it's important to vote for president, but it's also just as important, or arguably more important, to make sure that you vote in your local midterm elections. Because if there are people representing your state that do not reflect your views and ideologies, then they're going to be making choices for your state that, you don't agree with. And then if someone represents your state in Congress that, doesn't reflect your views, then they are also going to be making choices you don't agree with. So it's super important that you are voting in your midterm elections so that you can have people in office that function and represent the values that you represent.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's steering a little bit too far away from just the economy question, but I agree with you. I think part of that, just to quickly touch on it, is we just kind of have to wait for a new generation of Congress members.
That's fair, but I mean, obviously, a lot of the blame, whether Gen Pop.
But just on the basis of the economy.
Okay.
So Congress and the president, tax policies in general. There are quite a few experts in regards to the economy that would say, well, those things don't ultimately affect a business cycle. They might, influence it slightly. It might set a direction,
right?
But it's not the one steering.
Tax breaks and loopholes and that kind of thing definitely have an effect on small businesses and growing businesses and what businesses are in which states and where they produce. Like, there's a lot that goes into it, and where they're getting breaks as far as taxes and things is important.
Yeah, I guess maybe where I'm leaning on this is I feel like tax policy has a lot more to do with the way the government's own fiduciary responsibilities come in the sense that they need money to provide social programs, they need money to provide protection, they need money to provide health care. They need all those things.
Right.
And so taxes really just affect their ability to do that. And while they do impact the economy as a whole, I think overall it's not as much of a driving force as sometimes we think it is.
Fair enough.
That's what I just want to posit.
Businesses are going to do what businesses are going to do.
Yeah, and I don't think, while I think a tax cut will absolutely benefit some businesses a hell of a lot more than others, I don't think that it's that much of a driving force that's going to completely change the way businesses operate.
It's kind of like if you're looking for somewhere to go to dinner, and one place serves pie and one doesn't. Pie is nice, but it is not always the deciding factor of where you go.
Well, I wholeheartedly disagree with
this. Okay, well, I'm trying to make a metaphor.
I thought false. The place doesn't have pie.
The tax
Why are they even in business?
Are a nice extra, but they are not necessary.
I hear what you're saying. So let's wrap this up. Since healthcare is such another big hot topic that presidential candidates and current sitting presidents talk about a lot, it'd be worthwhile to discuss whether or not presidents actually have any power over that, and it should come as no surprise that they don't really have a whole lot of explicit power over the healthcare system.
Right.
But that being said,
why would they, though?
Well, healthcare policy is a legislative concern. So anytime you're dealing with a legislative problem, the blame and responsibility, if you're going to direct your anger towards someone, really needs to fall on Congress as opposed to a president, as far as what their roles are in this process on paper. But there is some things that a president can do to influence healthcare policy. They have three options.
Right, because you have, Obamacare was clearly influencing healthcare policy.
Yeah, well, the Affordable Care Act, Obama had...
Pardon, it is not called Obamacare. It is called the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, so the Affordable Care Act, should be noted, was passed through the legislative process.
Okay,
so Obama had a congressional candidate bring it to the floor. It got passed. And that's why Donald Trump is having such a hard time repealing it, is because it did go through the legislative process. It's not
an executive order.
It's not an executive order, which means that you have to do a lot more work to get something like a law overturned.
Okay.
That being said, so you could President Trump enacted executive orders to try and overthrow, or rather undermine some of the policies in the Affordable Care Act, but he can't overturn the law itself.
Right. Okay.
The second method is legislative initiative. So this would just be to find something to change it, right? So to come up with a law or a policy. This is what the Affordable Care Act was. It was part of a legislative initiative by Obama.
Okay.
And so he got someone to pick it up in Congress and say, yeah, I like this, puts it up for a vote, it gets passed.
Okay.
So the third option, and I think is something very important to talk about here, is the president's influence over public opinion. So this become a little bit more of a prominent topic since Twitter became a thing for president. So the president has the capacity, and this is maybe an informal power that I forgot to mention, to call a press conference whenever he wants, talks to the media whenever he wants.
Right.
And recently, since Donald Trump, post on Twitter whenever he
Go
wants.
on news shows whenever he wants.
And so you can influence public opinion that way in the shape of pressuring Congress to pass something as far as legislation goes.
Right.
The other thing that the president can do is when he makes his State of the Union address, he can put pressure on Congress to pass certain initiatives that he wants to see passed.
Okay.
But that's really the extent to which a president has the power to do anything with healthcare policy.
Right. But I think we should Twitter specifically and how Donald Trump is utilizing it. We've talked about this before. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, he has very effectively utilized Twitter and used it to charge his fan base, more so than any other president has ever done. And so that is fairly impressive. The fact that he's been able to
I'll
use
give
it.
him that. I'll give him that.
Yeah. So it almost makes me wonder if this is changing the culture of what it means to be president or what it means to act presidential or, I don't have a problem with a president using social media to reach out to his supporters and engage with his supporters and with the country and to share. I have problems with maybe using Twitter for hatefulness when you are the president. But I think that's an interesting new thing that's being introduced into our government.
Yeah, and checks and balances in social media is something that we could talk about for days. And we'll definitely have to get to it at some point.
Fair enough.
But just some final thoughts. So what I kind of got out of this was that most of the power that we think a president has and most of the responsibility that we put on them for having is more of a Congress thing. It's more their inability to get things done, and that leads them to passing a bunch of presidents passing a bunch of executive orders because they don't think Congress can get anything done. And then we have some debate on whether or not the executive branch is expanding too much, if they're getting too much power when they pass a bunch of executive
dipping
orders.
Their toes into too many pools.
And so you can probably attribute most of these expanding executive powers to the inefficiency of Congress.
Okay.
And I would say public opinion around this, or rather the public impression of that they're not very patient. They don't want to wait for some of these things to change. And our government's not very flexible right now when it needs to be. And so I feel like all these frustrations on the side of the American people, though warranted, I feel puts pressure on presidential candidates to get things done faster and more efficiently with very few checks and balances. And therefore, you can get somebody that comes into office and pushes a lot of really bad ideas, and there's not a whole lot preventing him from doing that.
Well, I mean, it feels like we're at a stalemate, right? The president wants to change things and improve the country and wants to do it now. But they need Congress to help legally make those changes happen. Meanwhile, Congress is constantly stuck in this weird limbo of not ever being able to proactively get things done or not get things done in a timely manner. So then you have executive orders that help counteract the slugginess of Congress, but then the executive orders maybe...
And both President Trump and Obama have a very similar viewpoint on Congress in that regard. So remember how I was saying how Obama told Congress, if you don't like my immigration policy, write a bill?
Do something about it.
Well, Trump did the same thing. If you don't pass a health care reform, I'm just going to sign an executive order. Same thing. So both presidents are absolutely, or Obama and Trump, are definitely demonstrating a preference for executive orders over the stalemate situation in Congress.
Yeah. So how do we fix, I mean, there's got to be a solution, right, to make Congress work better so we can continue to limit the power of the president. I don't know what it is, but...
I think part of it is going to be this cultural this is my theory. This is theory crafting.
All right, give me a theory, boy.
For me, I feel like it's going to be a cultural shift in Congress. So
okay.
I think it's going to take years. I think there's going to be this generational shift in Congress. And it's just they're going to decide, okay, all this old way of doing things and the norm doesn't work at all. I think that there's going to be some serious changes to the way our government functions within our lifetime.
So once we fill up the Congress with some young blood.
Well, for just starters, get me somebody that knows how the internet works.
Yeah.
Get me somebody who knows how the internet works, because that's like 90% of what goes on in our lives these days.
Mm-hmm. Also, I don't love the idea of 70-plus-year-old people making decisions for the country when y'all ain't gonna be around much longer, but you're making decisions for us. We're gonna be here for a while, so
We're a little ageist when it comes to
specifically Congress.
Specifically Congress.
Specifically Congress.
Like we don't mind old people. Congress just happens to be.
It's old, rich, privileged white people. That's the problem. They never worked a hard day in their life. Anyway.
Well, that pretty much wraps it up.
Shitting on
But
Congress.
Seriously, guys, tell us what you think. As always, hit that like button, subscribe, leave your comments below. Let us know where you want to see us go with our content.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where you want some more fun stuff, where we talk about Game of Thrones, which
Please.
like I'm okay with that. I really am. Don't get me wrong, I love talking about this stuff. I love learning about it and just having an in-depth conversation about things that we absolutely should.
Right,
be
but we need
about.
breaks too. Like we can only handle
breaks.
so much of this as well. Just dense, depressing shit.
Yeah, and you know whose fault it is. It's obviously Obama's fault.
Thanks, Obama.
Thanks, Obama.
We should just end the podcast right. Thanks, Obama. End of episode.
And George R. Martin for not writing fast enough. We can blame him for that as well.
What's George R. Martin doing right now? Not writing.
That's what he's doing.
Not writing.
That's what he's doing.
Have a good day, guys.
Have a good day, guys.
Bye.
I don't know when I said that last part. I think I said have a good day.
How about you say bye? Just
bye.
Bye.